It started as a routine traffic stop, but within moments, it turned into something much bigger. An elderly black man, calm and composed, was pulled over by a young, overzealous police officer who had no idea who he was dealing with. The officer's tone was aggressive, his actions forceful, and despite the man's respectful demeanor, things escalated fast. The cop thought he was in control, but he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. As bystanders watched in shock, the officer ignored the man's quiet warnings, treating him like just another suspect. But then, just as he was about to put the cuffs on, the truth came out. The man wasn't just anyone. He was an FBI agent with decades of experience and more power than the officer could ever imagine. And that's when karma came knocking. What happened next? Let's just say the cop learned a lesson he'd never forget. The officer tightened his grip on the man's arm, his voice firm. "Step out of the car," he ordered. The elderly man sighed but didn't argue. He had seen this kind of situation play out before, too many times. As he moved slowly, his hands raised, the officer's impatience grew. "Move faster," he snapped, reaching for his radio. Bystanders watched, some recording on their phones, whispering among themselves. Something felt off. The man wasn't resisting. He wasn't acting guilty. In fact, he seemed almost amused. The officer had no idea that the man he was treating like a suspect had spent his life serving the country. He didn't know about the countless undercover missions, the dangerous criminals this man had taken down, or the respect he commanded in the highest levels of law enforcement. And then, just as the officer reached for his handcuffs, the man finally spoke, calm but firm. "Son, you might want to rethink what you're doing." The officer scoffed, tightening his grip on the cuffs. "Oh yeah, and why's that?" He shot back, his tone laced with sarcasm. He was young, confident, too confident. He thought he had complete control over the situation. But he didn't notice the way the older man held himself, steady and unshaken, as if he'd seen this kind of trouble before. A small crowd had gathered now, whispering, recording, waiting to see what would happen next. Some were already recognizing the elderly man, their eyes widening as they exchanged murmurs. One man nudged his friend. "I know him. That's Agent Carter, FBI." The officer didn't hear them. He was too focused on proving a point. He reached for his radio. "I've got a suspect refusing orders. Send backup." Agent Carter sighed. "Son, I'd advise you to check my ID before you make this worse for yourself." But the officer wasn't listening, and that was his first mistake. The officer ignored the murmurs around him, too caught up in his authority to notice the shift in the air. He yanked the elderly man's arm, forcing him toward the squad car. "I don't need to check anything. You're resisting, and that's all I need to see." Agent Carter shook his head, his patience wearing thin. He had spent decades in law enforcement, training officers just like this one. Young, eager, but blinded by their own assumptions. He knew where this was headed, and it wasn't going to end well for the officer. Suddenly, another voice cut through the tension. "I'd step back if I were you." A deep, commanding tone. A second officer had arrived, but not as backup. He was older, seasoned, and as soon as he laid eyes on Carter, his face went pale. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. The young officer frowned. "What? You know this guy." The senior officer swallowed hard. "That's not just a guy. That's Special Agent Carter, FBI." The crowd fell silent. The young officer's grip loosened. His confidence drained in an instant. His hands trembled slightly as he glanced back at Carter, realization sinking in. He had just made a very, very big mistake. The young officer's face turned pale as the weight of his mistake hit him. His grip on the cuffs loosened, but before he could step back, Agent Carter finally moved. Not in anger, not in frustration, but with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove. "Now," Carter said, his voice low but firm, "I suggest you listen very carefully." He reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, pulling out his leather FBI badge. The gold lettering gleamed under the streetlights. The senior officer stiffened, nodding in respect. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said quickly. But before anyone could take a breath, the radio crackled. "Suspect on the run. Officer down." The message was urgent, and from the look on the senior officer's face, it wasn't just any suspect. It was someone dangerous. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Who's the suspect?" he asked, slipping into work mode. The senior officer hesitated. "An ex-cop. One we've been tracking for months. He's armed and he won't go down easy." The young officer, still frozen in shock, barely processed what was happening. But Carter had already made up his mind. "Then let's go get him." The night wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. Without hesitation, Agent Carter slid into the front seat of the senior officer's cruiser. The young officer, still shaken, scrambled into the back, his arrogance now replaced with silent regret. The radio crackled again. "Suspect spotted near 5th and Main, armed and dangerous." The tires screeched as they sped toward the scene. Carter's mind was already working ahead, piecing things together. An ex-cop on the run, desperate enough to take down an officer. Something wasn't adding up. As they arrived, they saw him, a man in dark clothing, gripping a gun, backing away from an injured officer on the ground. Carter stepped out slowly, hands raised. "It's over. Put it down." The suspect's eyes locked onto Carter's, and for a second, something flickered in his expression. Recognition. "You," he muttered, his voice unsteady. Carter's stomach dropped. He knew this man. Not just as a suspect, but from years ago, an officer he had once trained. "You don't have to do this," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. The suspect's grip trembled. Then sirens wailed, lights flashed, and in that moment, he made his choice. One that would change everything. The suspect's hands trembled, his breathing heavy. For a long moment, no one moved. Then with a deep, shuddering breath, he let the gun slip from his fingers. It clattered to the pavement, and officers rushed in, securing him in handcuffs. The tension finally broke, replaced by an eerie silence. Carter exhaled, his years of experience telling him this could have ended much worse. He looked into the suspect's eyes, seeing something familiar. Regret, exhaustion, maybe even relief. "You made the right choice," Carter said quietly before stepping back. The young officer stood nearby, watching everything unfold, his earlier arrogance completely gone. He had learned a lesson tonight, one he would never forget. As Carter turned to leave, the senior officer gave him a nod of respect. As the night settled, Carter walked away, knowing justice had been served. But deep down, he also knew there was always another case waiting.